Sorry, well, I do my glasses. Oh, that's that. Right. Great.
Okay, everybody, I think we may make a start. It's great to see so many people here this evening. There's a reason why, I'm sure.
Oh,
Anyway, just before we get started, go through the usual white people. Off or in silent. The problems with fire alarms and things. If the worst happened, just point out the fire exits with 2 at the top of the lecture theatre, 1 on either side here. Could please sign the signing in sheet is being circulated. If you wouldn't mind, please just signing it. You know how many people are here. And rendezvous point is at the front of the building in the car park. So it's my great pleasure this evening to introduce our speaker tonight. I'm sure Thomas is very well known to a lot of you. And who don't know him, Thomas is a landscape archaeologist with a particular interest in archaeology, intertidal archaeology, and garden archaeology, amongst other things. You probably remember him with his association with the University of Ulster as a senior researcher. Covered the oldest tidal mill in the world at Lendrum, which dated to 619.
very good, very good.
Amongst other things, and he's certainly very well published. 2 exceptional volumes, one on Strangford Lough as a whole. So he's also, I believe, worked out in Tasmania and East Africa, which is something I didn't know about.
Brief periods, but very exciting.
And anyway, his lecture is always thought-provoking, interesting, and occasionally controversial.
Oh dear.
So we look forward to hearing him on the subject this evening, which is Church Island and Lough Beg. Thanks, Tom.
Thank you very much, Anne. Great honour to address the society again. And in previous existence, I think back in the 1980s, I was on the committee for a few years. But I last addressed the society in 2000. Hope you all note it took them 25 years before they invited me back again. My subject tonight is very close to my heart because I'm wearing 2 hats. I'm an archaeological hat, landscape archaeologist, but also because I'm from South Derry and I'm talking about my own local landscape. And for you non-South Derry people, the first thing I should fix for you, Duncan, why is this not moving? Is the location. Oh, I don't use that one. Great. Right. Lough Beg is an island, but as you shall hear, it's a former island now joined to the mainland in Lough Beg. And Lough Beg, north of Lough Neagh, is part of the sort of band system, the lower band system. This map was prepared by James up here for me, and he's done a great thing. He has adjusted it to the pre-band drainage, pre-mid-19th century drainage levels. So the island is an island. Probably most of you don't know that area very well. You zoom through, come off the M2 on your way to Derry or elsewhere and sail past it. But I always think if just before Toome there's a hill, if you come over the hill, all South Derry is laid out before you, and you've got Slieve Gallion as quite a dramatic backdrop, and you've got the other rim of the Sperrins. And if you look to the south, you see Lough Neagh, and then quite soon Lough Beg come into view. This is a very different part of the Irish landscape in medieval history, in that it was regarded as the most wooded part of Ireland. 2 great forests, the Forest of Killecha and Glen Con came, and it was regarded as a place apart, even within the Gaelic word. And it's a place of refuge, it's a place where armies went in retreat, it's a place where people hid their cattle, etc. And most notably, it was really the last bit of getting Ireland, because here in the late summer, autumn, winter, and early spring of 1603, Hugh O'Neill, Earl of Tyrone, made his last stand before in March giving up the ghost and gone down to Mellifont and made a submission to a now dead Queen Elizabeth, and then ushered in the plantation. So it's fascinating for many different aspects. We, as I always say, have great archaeological bragging rights because of our many finds, because of Church Island, because of our megaliths up in the Sperrins. But in its last couple of years, with great pride, Ireland's latest bog body has been found just about where the eye on the island is. And we've Lough Beg here from the Ulster Museum, and Neve and her team are doing fantastic investigation work, which all will be revealed. But it's the body of a young woman, and ritually we think decapitated and deposited in the body. But also then just north too, we have New Ferry, we excavated first in the 1930s by the Harvard Mission, followed on by Pat Collins, followed on by Peter Woodman, so it ranks high in the Mesolithic archaeology of Ireland. So I have to warn you, I'm going to try and cover a very long period, basically maybe from the 6th century to today. So it'll be a gallop, and I'm going to try to avoid going down rabbit holes or tripping them. And Rowan, maybe if I skim over some things, you'll invite me back in 2050 to continue. The island, though very, very small, it's very prominent in all the early maps of Ulster, starting from about 1600. And here you have a series of them. And it marks the original name of the island, which can be pronounced in different ways, but basically it's Innishtiddy or Teague. This is the island today, after the 19th century band drainage. And you can see the original island is this triangular, small area, only about 8 acres, very, very small. You can see then the band has dropped, and it's now on the western side, joined totally to the mainland, but quite off insulated again at times of heavy rain. Now, just to quickly orientate you to how the lecture will proceed, I've divided into 3 different periods because there's 3 very distinct horizons in the history and archaeology of Ireland. There's the medieval period, which you see the dating bracket there, and that's this monastic phase. Today, after great recent research, we always ask the question, was that church monastic or was it another type of ecclesiastical establishment? But we're quite clear that the settlement on Church Island was monastic. Then all changes in the 12th century, great period of reorganization of the Western Church, formal delineation of parishes and dioceses, and a lot of the old monasteries were incorporated into this new system. So this is what I call the parish church phase. We've got documentation on the parish priests, the Earl-Knacks and the Earl-Knack system, which I'll go into briefly later on, and those scullions. And there's at least 2 scullions here, so that's lovely. And then plantation, after the 17th century, when the church was deliberately abandoned, a new church on the Anglican tradition was built in Ballyscullion. But the graveyard, as the ancestral graveyard, continued on, and it also became continued as a place of pilgrimage for the local community. And then with this wonderful horizon in 1910, where as a part of the Gaelic revival, etc., the pilgrimage was put up a notch and revived. And then we have the reality of the site today. The area within the graveyard walls in state care, and then the rest of the island is scheduled. And then it's surrounded by loads of designations in SSI. It's a natural landscape thing. When we worked in Strangford Law, some wit came up with this definition of Strangford Law. It was a body of water surrounded by committees. The Church Island is a wee bit like that. No, not quite as bad. Now, as regards to monastic archaeology, the first thing we have to discuss is the patron saint. The stronger the saint, the more important the monastery was. If the saint had a great cult, revenues flowed in, people wanted to go there. People wanted to be buried there because there was that great belief if you were buried in the same ground as an important saint that you got up there faster. The name of our saint is quite difficult for the uninitiated. Basically, in Northern Irish, we pronounce St Thaddeus, shortened form of St Teague. The church had difficulty with all the Irish saints because they needed to Latinize them for the mass and for their literature. They were quite careless. They normally went to the nearest sort of equivalent saint, something that sounded a bit like the Irish name. And for us, they chose the Palestinian apostle, St Thaddeus or St Thaddeus. And it's highly likely, of course, totally unlikely that Thaddeus ever put his foot in church town. But curiously enough, there's a lot of Palestinian flags around Ballyscullion, so that might establish some sort of connection. The name is variously spelled. Well, that list I've given you here, but the most common form of this is Teague or Teague. And its feast day is the 7th of September. And we've got that documented in 3 of the early martyrologies. These are great documents that list all the Irish saints and when their feast days are. They were compiled for the liturgy of the Mass that saint was invocated, prayed for that day. So we've got it in the martyrology of Tallaght, we've got it in Gorman, and we've got it in Donegal. That's all we know about Teague. There's no fragments of a saint's life. Normally there's not a saint's life, we get mentioned in other saint's life. We assume that it could possibly be 5th century missionary, disciple of Patrick, more likely to be a 6th century local figure, probably belonging to one of the local dynasties like our other local saints. The only other local associations are a townland to the west called Toberhead, which celebrates a holy well belonging to him. But of course, his name became very popular, and you all know that the slur for an Irishman in the 19th century, and about this period, they called him a Teague. And St Thaddeus would be very interested to see his cult still alive in Glasgow, Belfast, in places. The reason why that happened was because we tend to think of Paddy and Mick, but at one period, Teague was common, first name. Translated sometime into English as Tim. But the word in official modern Irish for like the man on the street is Teague of the market. Now, quick gallop through monastic archaeology to put it in context. Study, research, archaeological research into the early Irish monasteries has really vastly increased in the last 25 years. We have new insights, we have new interpretations. And of course, the bottom line is we now realize that how much they dominated the landscape and they were within these large enclosures and have had a myriad of functions and really were the backbone of society and interacted in interesting ways with the secular society. In fact, they themselves became very powerful politically, etc. Now, of course, my own favourite monastery is one of the most complete, is Nendrum, where we did the excavation and found the earliest tide mill in the world and also the earliest mill in Ireland. This displays beautifully something I'll mention in a minute or two. Many of our Irish monasteries were built to a very definite plan of a series of enclosures, sometimes maybe only one, more often 2, and quite often 3. And I'll highlight the significance of that in a minute. Now, I'll show you another monastic island nearby. This is Ramsden in Lough Beg. It's almost exactly the same size as Church Island. Yet it had the wealth of the patronage to put up a big round tower. Maybe we'll find a round tower at Nendrum if we do excavation. I don't, or at the Church Island. That's all to be found out. Islands were extremely popular for early monastic communities, both freshwater islands, but more especially tidal islands, because they offered the chance to be half in the world and half out of the world, and a place to avoid secular society, a place for contemplation. But then they became victims of their own piety in that people wanted to go there, people wanted to patronize them, people wanted to rubble a relic, etc. So they became central places in the landscape, but yet continued on in quite isolated, hard to reach areas. And one of their primary functions, especially in the major monasteries, was to disseminate Holy Writ, and we have these wonderful works of art like the Book of Kells, Book of Dur, etc. We have tremendous schools of sculpture, probably masons that were attached to monasteries. As the period progressed, tools got better. Iron tools became almost of steel quality, and they could produce these beautiful high crosses. This is our nearest neighbour to Church Island or Darbo. But my main interest, and the one that I would claim, is the real glory of the monasteries and the financial economic underpinning is their wealth in land. And this is a map I compiled many years ago. It's still in progress from later medieval sources, maybe 17th century ones, of the landed wealth of our early monasteries. And you see how extensive it is. In fact, it's probably fuller because there has been alienations over the centuries. And you see the creation of Church Island, which has got quite an extensive estate of about 8 townlands. You see its two neighbour monastic houses of McErlean and Connor, but you see the great estates like the Patrician Church in Armagh, etc. And this is it today. James, thanks for the map. Study these and reconstruction of these is vitally important because in ancient Ireland, so prior to the 12th century and even later, we don't have any land charters recording extent of churches, of estates or whatever, but we do have a continuation of ownership. And so we can reconstruct little parts of the mosaic of early medieval landholding, and then it helps us reconstruct secular estates, and it's a fantastic aid to reconstruct settlement organization, distribution things. Again, that's a 2050 topic there, which I'll avoid. So, start with archaeology. The underground archaeology, what lies beneath. And the big question mark is that we don't know what's happening in Church Island because it's never been excavated, which is both good and bad because it's all to be revealed. But what we can say, it's going to be very complex because of the multi-period nature of the site. It's going to be deep, but it's going to be extremely rich in information. And it's a tiny little peek through the curtains. Stephanie McErlean on the state curtain with HED had to do a tiny little excavation a couple of years ago when they were renewing a buttress for the graveyard wall, and she found one shared silver ware, which is the early medieval pottery. So that gives us a little indication that we're going to find a lot. But there is a few instances of above ground archaeology. Probably the most prominent is the Ballon. I think you all know what a Ballon is. If you don't, it's a boulder or big stone with a hollow in it. And the hollow, or maybe 2 hollows, or maybe 3, are believed to be the imprints of a saint kneeling to prayer. And the water that gathers in that hollow is believed to have miraculous qualities, and that can cure. The Ballon on Church Island is called St Patrick's Stone. Now, we don't know, it's very interesting that the island has strong patrician associations. We don't know how true that is because there's a pattern among Irish monasteries, Irish churches, that some of the great national saints like Bridget Conmacall and Patrick tend to eclipse in the folklore and traditions our more local saints. So the original stone may be associated with today's. And here is a wonderfully moving, I think, evocative drawing of the Ballon stone in 1836, a part of the memoirs. And it shows this poor person brought to the island by boat. Probably this is one of his last hopes for a cure. As I tell people when we visit balls or field trips, this was probably the only National Health Service of the time. This is where one went to get cured. The practice is you dipped a rag in the water in the hollow, you rubbed it in the affected spot, you put the cloth on what we call a rag tree or clotty tree, As it rotted, your ailment went away. Now, it's become the custom for politicians throughout the world, when they want to appear statesman-like, they get their speechwriters to dig up a Seamus Heaney coat. And I'm not to be outdone in that, but I can defend myself that Seamus was brought up within sight of the Lough at Anahoris, just in the southwest of the Lough. And also his grandmother was Sarah Scullion, so he had a genetic link to the gardens of the island. And I probably murdered this by reading it, but I'll have a go anyway, because it's a most beautiful poem. The legend tells how Patrick waded the shallow water to pray 7 days and nights on the island amongst stone and water hens that spluttered dirtily in the sedge. Came with eyes blazing and knees hard as a stiff staff for prayer, fast and penance, and knelt there continuously 1 week, branding Christ into the stone. Rain collects in these holy cups, sanctified where it falls, to be soaked in faithful rags, dabbed on blisters, warts, and boils, with prayers that the island's saint may cleanse such corrupting flesh. The wet cloths are hung to dry on twigs of stunted hawthorn, spiking out of a dead trunk, a multiform crucifix decked with streamers of pain that celebrates St Patrick's benediction of the rain. And pilgrims never bother to find if the legend's true. It serves their end by being what pilgrims would like to do. Now, I find one line that extremely moving. Decked with streamers of pain. Only a poet like Seamus Heaney could create a sort of metaphor for what those cloths are. You know, when you visit a site and you see them still used, what they represent. They represent people in distress, people with terminal illness, etc., etc. Seamus wrote another poem dedicated to the Lough tree, which I'll just quote a bit of it. Wart, blade, and cancer wipe clean as a bead. Their touch cloths nodded in the wind. So this is the ballon here, and with water in it. Now there's this modern notion of you see a bit of water and you throw 3 coins on a fighting type thing. We're trying to discourage that because it's not a part of the original thing. And here shows an example of people depositing it here. But I say to HED, since it's so badly funded now, they probably should encourage this more, and they could use the pennies to finance them. And now they're starting to charge for visits to state care sites for tour guides and things. I think they'll have to install a swipe card at the side or whatever. So moving on fast, the other outstanding bit of above ground archaeology is the quay located on the western part. And this quay probably was in continuous use, maybe from the 7th century right until the mid-19th century drainage. It is of an interesting formation. It's more a slipway with 2 little walls at either side. One can imagine when the flotilla of boats would arrive on the island on a Sunday or other times, that would be packed tight of little boats pulled in there. Now the last main upstanding bit of known archaeology is to deal with this sacred topography. I mentioned the science of enclosures. Here in its most elaborate form is the triple form. We have it at Nendrum, we have it at Armagh, we have it to a certain extent at Iona, if interpreted a certain way, but we have it at most of our major sites. And this is a way of organizing monastic space. They were very complex organizations. They, of course, were holy, were communities of monks were there to pray, but also there were like markets, there were craft activities, there were farmyards. So how they organized that was you had a central space, which is the holiest, and that's where the church was, and that's where the graveyard was. That was the ritual space. Slightly less holy, second enclosure where you had your craft shops where the monks slept and ate, etc. Then an outer area, which is much more secular, which was the farmyard where people assembled. And maybe it was only on very high days and holidays the laity were allowed into the central enclosure. And at keep an eye on the clock here. At Church Island, we have the trace, very low trace, faint trace of the enclosure around the church. It's about 6 meters wide and it's only about 40 centimeters high. but if we extrapolate from that, and there it is there, you can almost see it. If we extrapolate from that, we can imagine an enclosure of maybe about 50, 60 meters across. No trace of a middle enclosure, but we regard on these small islands that the actual shoreline becomes, it's sort of the mystical enclosure. So, for some reason, everybody loves the glamour of the violence of Viking raids. And local folklore or people say, oh, the Vikings raided Church Island. We have no documentary reference of that they did, but I'm sure they did, because during the first wave of the Viking incursions between 825 and 876, we had a Viking camp in Lough Beg. We think Cormac, some research that we think the camp was at the mouth of the main river on the Shays Castle estate. Probably was there. And from there, they were able to raid through the band system and South Armagh, a lot of central Ulster. And we do know from the Annals of Ulster that in 832, its two neighbours on either side were attacked. The great monastery of St Lough in McErlean and monastery of St Connor. So it's highly likely that the Vikings were on Church Island and maybe even had their Longford camp there. Second big wave in the north anyway is this period in the 10th century. But we had a very strong political kingdom there, the Culminating, and they had their own fleets, and they extinguished the Vikings basically on the north and drove them out, beat them at their own game to a certain extent, which is good and was bad. It means we didn't have towns like Dublin and Cork and Waterford, etc. So I know you've gone up through we can't have a whole synthetic history of the island, but we have these snippets where suddenly it comes into prominence or there's a mention, which are very interesting. Get another rabbit hole, which are deal with very fast. I said these monasteries became central places in the landscape, so therefore they attracted a great competition between different territorial groups. And Church Island had the misfortune to be in a sort of fault line between two most powerful groups in Ulster, the Northern Yield under the Kinloan and the Ulstermen on east of the Ban, and there was constant friction between the two. And if you had a church or monastery there, you were in the foreign line. And we do have one reference in a few of the annals to an instance here in 1129. The Annals of Ulster are quite laconic. They just mentioned this person who died. This was a noble from Inishowen, so he obviously probably part of the Kinloan army, and that he was killed by the Ulster on Inistiddy. The Annals of Ulster Fallen give us much more information, which is great. They discuss the plunder of Inistiddy by the Ulla, in which, and this is very important, the son of the McErlean, that's of high king status, his grandfather was, very, very important person, the king of Aya, king of the Kinloan. Also, another local noble, one of the Flynns. At this stage, we don't know where the Flynns, the original royal family of South Derry, whether they were in the western side of that, or whether, as we know, they moved to the eastern side. He was killed too, and many others. So this, I want to stress, it's not one of these raids. It wasn't like a Viking raid. This was a pitched battle of two armies in that small space of about 8 acres. So it must have been covered in blood. Two armies fighting out there, and many casualties. We've got a side head at the background, because earlier in Innisfallen, suggested maybe it's earlier the same summer, it was a big clash on the Ban a bit at the great ford of Camas below Coleraine, and the monastery of St Comgall on the western side. Basically, this was a ford battle, and that was raided by the Ulstermen. But then we have sort of conclusion that later on in the year, there was a change of kings. One king of Aya died, and his son took over, and he sorts out the Ulstermen and takes hostages from them and many of the principal chiefs. So that's really the last throw of the dice between the friction of those two groups that we know about before the before the new Anglo-Norman influenced countryside. Now we came. That's the first third of the lecture over. Oh, not too bad. We changed gear. Monastery gone. By this time, either the monastery ceased to exist as a communal organization, or maybe it still existed, but their estate was there, and it was incorporated into this great reform. This reform started in the late 11th century by Pope Gregory, but followed on by other popes, and took place all through Europe. And the main thrust of it was the spatial formalization of dioceses and the constituent parishes. Of course, dioceses and parishes existed before, but maybe not in the same form. But this was a very strict delineation in the landscape. It meant that every person on the Irish landscape had affiliations, was tied to a church, and the church would have provided responsible for that person to give him pastoral care, but also that was the church he had to pay his tithes to, that 1/10 of his income. A lot of research in recent years, some of it good on the origin of parishes, but we still are not clear how it was carried out. But it seems clear that each diocese had a slightly different history. My opinion is that the actual formalization of parishes was totally in tandem with the formalization of the diocese, and that they all belong to the mid-12th century. We do have evidence of some of the dioceses that maybe it was a bit slower, and they might have been formally delineated by the 13th century, but for the northwestern Irish diocese and the ones east of the Bann, they're nearly all the new parishes formed in the 12th century. But of course, they were founded on previous existing special units. Most of the research on the 12th century form is focused on the great individuals, the great reforming churchmen, like St Malachy, and like our own Bishop of Derry, Bishop of Coffey, and other figures, and the kings that were encouraging it and organising it. But there's very, very little research on the actual mechanisms and the problems. Obviously, the single biggest problem was the division of assets. With all this church land, the church needed land to endow the bishops for their estate and for their status. The problem was we had centuries of ownership or control of those estates by families. These were the Aaronic families, and some compromise had to be made. What I call the Aaronic system, we know a lot about it from a formal submission they made at the plantation 1609 about the role, and they claimed probably quite rightly that they held their land for centuries before bishops were invented in Ireland, and that many of them were descended from the founding saints family or from the family that give the land to the church. Now, in the Western Diocese, Derry, the part of Armagh into Hibernian goes, Raphoe, Kilmore, a lot of the Connaught diocese came to this lovely compromise in that they were left intact and they were given absolute insurances they could not be evicted. But they were given 1/3 of the tithes, what's called elsewhere the Episcopal third. And from that, they paid what we would call a rent to the bishop. But they also had to maintain the parish church, the family parish church. We think, from other allusions, maintain a house of hospitality. And probably they had established or maintained a local school. These families are a separate caste in Irish society. They didn't belong to the Gaelic elite, Gaelic nobility, but they belonged to the learner classes, and they were sort of church families, and they're absolutely fascinating. In our area, they're very well defined, and a lot of them are still found where their ancestors were. Just north in Kilrea, we got the Diamonds. The next parish up is Desert Toll, and those tolls. My parish, just north of Ballyscullion, is Tamil Acryli, but the Acrylis, we have the Scullions for here, for Ballys, parish of Ballyscullion, but west with the Keats for Terminini, etc. Now, again, this is a rabbit hole I'm going to avoid and go through very quickly. These great men, the core of the new parishes, the vast majority of them, you'll read in the current literature that they were largely based on pre-existing territories. This is not quite accurate. The most important dimension of them is they were formed for the division of these great monastic estates. And they were divided so every parish had a bit of church land in it. So you can see that all over Ireland if you reconstruct the church lands and then the parish outline. Sometimes maybe one whole monastic estate was formed into parish, but more likely it was divided with 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 parishes. That was one side of the division. The other aspect was part of the 12th century reform. This is the time of the introduction of the great continental monastic orders, the Augustinians, the Cistercians, etc. Most of the Irish monastic houses immediately adopted the Augustinian rule because that was quite like their way of life they had before under their own independent rule. And the Augustinians were out in society a bit and they had a pastoral role. Now, the great Patrician Abbey in Armagh, they adopted the Augustinian rule. And it was renamed St Peter and Paul. People wonder why didn't they keep the name St Patrick. But their greatest relic, or one of the greatest relics they had in Armagh from early times, supposedly bought by Patrick, were some of the relics of St Peter and Paul. We'll find here in the lower Bann Valley, we'll find that these pre-existing monastic estates, half of them were given to St Peter and Paul Armagh, the other half as Arabic lands with the Arabic families on them, and they were the ones that supplied the bishop. And this happened in Church Island. So this is the estate of Church Island divided with this eastern bit, which belonged to Armagh, called the Great Ballyscullion. This western bit of the estate became the Arabic lands and continued on in the hands of the Scullions, paying the bishop a due rent. And this is where the rents of the Granges went. A Grange, as you probably all know, is the name we give to an outlying property of a monastic house. An outlying property away from the main house. This is a very sad drawing of Armagh towards the end of the 9 Years' War in ruins. The red bit is the Abbey of St Peter and Paul, and that's where the rents of Ballyscullion would have went. We do know from a 14th century reference to their lands at Kilrea that they paid their rent in eels, paid it in kind. And this is sort of documentation we reconstruct the church lands for. This is a grant about 1613 of the Grange of Ballyscullion to Toby Caulfield that eventually passed into the McErlean family of Antrim. So this is a map, one of many maps James to be prepared for me on paper about the origin of these parishes. And the top bit shows the original pre-12th century monastic estate. And then the bottom one shows the division in the new disposition. And then I would urge anybody who's going to make a pilgrimage to Church Island, which I hope you will after my lecture, you can end the day at what is the most famous thing now about the Grange, and that's Crosskeys Pub. It's an oasis of crack and cool. And Vincent, that's me for a free pint, I hope. Anyway, and this is just to hammer that division thing home. This is the undivided estate pre-12th century, and this is the division after the 12th century. And we can repeat that pattern all over Ireland. And then this is the parish that was formed out of it. The red shows the Arabic lands. The lands on both sides of Lough Beg, and even until today, that townland of Ballyscullion East, which we call north side of the river, Far Ballyscullion, It's the only part of the Derry diocese that's actually in County Antrim. So we can quickly trace through papal documentation, through the Armagh registers, various small snippets of information about these parish churches, including Church Island. And here is the papal taxation of 1306. That's the single greatest sort of baseline we have for all the parishes in Ireland. It was originally a tax to finance the Crusades, one of the Crusades, but it's highly unlikely money ever reached Rome because the kings in the various parts of Europe pocketed a lot of the money themselves. And here we have the older name of Teague, that rock. And interestingly, it's valued at 1 mark, which is the same of a much bigger, much more important monastery in the past of Mahara, Then we have this Armagh register from Bishop Colton's visitation of the diocese in 1397. And here we have the first documentation of the scullions. The name of the parish has been changed. It's called Ballyscullion. But of course, the scullions were there much earlier. But it shows how their airlines contributed to sort of the names of the parishes. So then quickly, we better look at the parish church. This is the parish church, or what it was like a few years ago. HED, it was long overdue for improvements. HED, about 20 years ago, at great expense, brought all the scaffolding out. And then whether it was for budgetary restrictions, whatever, they never came back. And the scaffolding became an ancient monument itself, much commented on by all we local communities. And I shouldn't criticize them because they've made great amends to spend a fortune on the thing. But then, deal quickly with the church. Believe it or not, it's probably the most extant church ruins, definitely in South Derry, and much further afield. In that, it's got its 2 gable walls and it's got the four long walls. You all know, ignore the spire for the moment because that's late 18th century. This is it. Spires say later. Believe it or not, that church is quite big. We have a rough estimate of how many people you get into a church by experimentation. It's been suggested you get about 3 people standing per square meter and the width of the seats. So using that formula, and I test this out at various sites where I have a good crowd for a field trip at various churches, and it seemed to work. So we at least get 450 people in there. So quite sizable. The next thing is, and what have I done something here? Aha, great. Analyzing what existing features we can observe and record. The door into the church was not as more common on the western gable, but was on the south wall. That's a pattern I'm very intrigued by. We don't know if it's any architecture or chronological significance, but you get both. Examining the parish churches of South Derry, the ones that have enough remains, about half of them have south wall doors, and about half of them have the other. Don't have a structural or whatever, but it's a very interesting variation of church architecture. This is the south wall. You can see the windows, you see the little ombre there. But this is the important bit of the church, the east end. And of course, the great east window has been robbed out. So many churches, first thing to go, don't know why, but it may have originally had very distinguished tracery, maybe Gothic tracery or whatever. Some of them were actually taken and put into the new 17th century churches. Others were just stolen. It's very sad it's gone. So we could imagine, try reconstruct from other contemporary churches. We think this may be largely 14th century, maybe 15th century. This beautiful tracery west window. The lighting follows the pattern in many early church sites. It's only really 3 windows, and they're on the east end, big east window, 2 on either side. The function of the lighting system on these churches was to throw as much light as they could onto the altar, which was just below there at the east end. There's 2 lovely little niches on either side. One we can identify as what we call a piscina. A piscina is a little bowl of water in that niche there, where the priest washed his hands during Mass as part of the ritual of the Mass. The one at Church Island is extremely interesting because it's the only indication of some of the architectural refinement in that it's of sandstone, and it's got this lovely little false ribbing here. Sadly, the sandstone is very soft, and I've seen this deteriorate in my own time, so it probably needs some urgent tender care. The nearest equivalent, and maybe even by the same mason, is 5 bits to the west in Ballyscullion, where we've got a surviving piscina, and it's got this little vaulting. The little lamprey on the south wall doesn't have anything to distinguish it with. Now, having a look at the windows, this is the window of Ballyscullion here. We can trace a bit of its outline here from surviving bit of not the masonry, but the mortar work up at above here, and it's clear it's one of those splayed windows with a narrow slot on the surface outside and then split in. Nearby, south of Tobermore, medieval parish church of Kilcronan. It was rebuilt, the south wall there was rebuilt in about 1820. And what they did is they had a surviving window and they reversed it. They obviously didn't want to destroy the nice architectural features. This bit is the inside of the church, it was originally the outer side. And it's the same sandstone as the ombre. So if we want to imagine what that window looked like from the outside, it's probably very like Kilcronan. And then a feature we find in most medieval churches is that the bell cot. This is where the bell would have been. And because it's on an island surrounded by a sheet of water, the sound of that bell would have travelled for miles. It would have echoed off the waterscape further on. So it would have been a very, very potent bell. Quickly, we'll go on to the scullions. Scullions, I've outlined the Archaeological system, and I would love to go into more detail about it because it's absolutely fascinating. Well, the scullions are Aronnax, and as I said, they give the name to the parish. And here we have the one I regard as the modern day. Aronnax is Colum Scullion, sitting up the back. Colum is a very expert local historian, has a diploma in archaeology from here, etc. Colum lives in a townland that's called after his family, and a parish that's called after his family, and probably its genetic link to that part of the landscape goes back over 1,000 years. So that's, you know, a wonderful thing to be able to say. And he also maintains the traditions of the family in that he has a splendid house of hospitality. So if you're looking at Airbnb, go to Colum's. As I said, Shimasini, quarter scullion, and this other very evocative poem, many of you probably know it, called the Lough Beg. He documents its scullions. He describes big voiced scullions, herders, feeders around haycocks and hindquarters, talkers and bars, and then a great Henny metaphor, slow arbitrations of the burial ground. Because they are like family in this case. The scullions would have had to look after the graveyard, they would have had to navigate any disputes over graves, etc., etc. So beautifully captured there. Then quickly through lists of priests. We won't hear about the priests largely if there's a dispute over the rectory or the vicarage or whatever, and it's ended up on the case has gone to Rome and then it's recorded as a part of the great Roman civil service. We've got the names of a few priests of the parish. The names are very interesting. For instance, that one, 1458, where we got Henry McBay taking over. The McBays were a very famous professional family, medical family in Gaelic Ireland and Gaelic Scotland, but they also doubled as secretaries for Gaelic lords who were very literate, and also dabbled in church appointments. And then we have the local, extended bit of the local royal family, elite family of the O'Neills. We have a 1500 there, Hugh Keelt. They were quite a prominent Archaeological family, clerical family of Termanini, a bit to the west. But the most interesting statement is this in 1458, which gives us a good confirmation of the secular context of Church Island. Quite often the church made an edict. This man was to become parish priest. there was might have been local opposition or all sorts of trouble. They had no military force or whatever. So they appealed to what they called the civil arm, the local Gaelic lord, to enforce their edict. And in this case, they're calling on Manus Mulholland to make sure that this guy is accepted by the priest. So that brings us to a whole new storyline, which we can't go into, on the Mulhollands. The Mulhollands had their estate surrounded the whole of the parish and surrounded the church lands. And they had their estate by virtue of the fact, or the great status, that they were hereditary guardians of St Patrick's Bell, which they shared with O'Melons. I have to mention the O'Melons because one of them here. But with this lovely statement in 1365, issued by the Archbishop from his manor in Termonfeckin, a sort of a special privilege is granted to the Mulholland family and to the Lord then, Conla, if he protected the integrity of Armagh, etc. He won't be excommunicated, and that he's to carry out the loyalty provisions of the Archbishop, which introduces quickly to the one of Ireland's greatest relics and artworks of the early 12th century, St Patrick's Bell, that's now in the National Museum. I won't have to go into this because Cormac here has published extensively of it. For a fascinating story, we last hear of it in 15th, 16th century, and then it disappears from history until there's the mention of the last keeper living in Shane's Castle on his deathbed, etc., etc., etc. You have to go and read Cormac's work on it. Now, Cormac did a lot of detective work to where it was found and was able to trace it to a town line nearby in Mayagall. And having done that, he arrived at the house and the family lived there. The McKennas had that very strong tradition. Of course, it was found in our garden. And the patriarch of the family, John Joe McKenna, it was one of his greatest wishes that it should be commemorated in some way, that is where the bell was kept. So in conjunction with John Joe and the extended McKenna family, Cormac and Ballyscullion and myself, we all got together and a stone was erected. And in a recent edition of Archaeology Ireland, Cormac has told the story. So try and read that. So last December, we had an unveiling of the stone. One of the most interesting things about the bell, it's got an inscription, or for the enshrining, it's got an inscription, and it appeals for a prayer for the King of Ireland at the time, the Bishop of Armagh, but also for the Mulholland of the time, who was the keeper. Now, the Mulhollands had a very large estate surrounding the lough. As a McErlean, I look at this with great anguish because we were brought, as Gaelic from Scotland, about 1550, and we were promised this estate on provision by the local lord we worked for, on provision we took it off of the Mulhollands, but we never did. They held on to it, but only for another 30, 40 years, because then went to the plantation. And this is their estate, this of townlands. So basically stretched all the way from Portcalone, near Marfelt, beyond Castle Dawson, and then at a separate portion. And this is the unveiling of our stone. Great day for the parish. It's a wonderful day because it brought archaeology right back into the community and brought a religious object back to its original spiritual significance, where it meant so much to the people. It wasn't just an art object. This was something they could identify with. And I say the prime mover, the very prime man was John Joe. And Cormac arranged for John Joe and the family to go to the National Museum earlier on in the year to see it. And he arranged for the director to come and welcome him. And Cormac, you captured the whole essence, I think, very well, in that the Mulhollands were hereditary keepers, but that mantle has been taken on very much by now the McKenna family. So in a way, they're hereditary keepers of the memory. And then John Joe was so pleased that that he achieved that before he died. And we buried him yesterday. And it's terribly sad because one of the great cultural figures of South Derry, vast knowledge and very articulate. A month ago, we had him in our local Heritage Society in Portland, brought him down, and he had a spellbound for an hour. And he took to his bed a few days later, and he died yesterday. So sad. Fantastic funeral they deserved. And this is the stone we put up. And basically, it records that this great relic was found. It's very close to the spot where it was. And this has become, a pilgrimage point in its own right. There's been people come here, it's been prayers held around it and visits to St Patrick's Day, etc. So it's we feel so glad working with John Joe and the McKenna family that has been achieved. Quickly now, I'll really start what time is it there? Oh, good, not too bad. I'll start the gallop then. 16th century, I said, I can only tell this story in snippets. We kind of a sort of consistent history, century by century. Now, I did address in this very auditorium a few years ago at the Discovery Programme this lovely action-packed landscape-filled information episode of the Earl of Sussex, the Lord Lieutenant, excursion to the north with a great army to subdue the MacDonalds, back up one branch of the Clandeboy O'Neills. And the Herald recorded the stories, and we know where they camped every night for about 5 weeks, and things they saw, etc., etc. This was the time Shane O'Neill, Shane the Proud, started to act up. They were able to muster all the other Gaelic lords to form part of the army to march on the Scots. Shane didn't turn up. So at Dromore, they separated the great army into two. One side of Lough Neagh. Earl of Sussex and his army came this way, camped in Belfast, Kells, and then over to Portland. Gives us a glimpse at the time. It gives us a bit of information on Church Island. They camped at the Great Assembly site within sight of the Lough at now called Tully, but in the document the Herald's Progress calls it Knockmulla. And it occurs and is copied from original map by a lot of the later maps. This speed makes it of all alpine proportions, which it wasn't. And this is the original map we think he took it for. It's this wonderful map we call the Dartmouth map because we don't know who compiled it, but it was a good idea. And if you look closely here, they've sketched in Tully. And here they say Knockmulla, a party hill, meaning a place of assembly, a place where you held Gaelic get-togethers, assemblies. But it shows other aspects of the local landscape. It shows, the map is compiled with 1601. It shows O'Neill's up-to-date fortification of what was a Crown Oak on the western side of Tuam. I've just cut off Tuam Castle here. It shows Innishtiddy, of course, which is lovely as prominent thing. It shows a great pass, which it names, through the woodland on the eastern side of the Ban, up from Tuam through Portland and further north. It shows Lough Inshulin, very historic Crown Oak, where Hugh O'Neill out of Tyrone made his last stand. But from this map, then we see Speed has exaggerated the Party Hill up here. This is the view from the top of the Party Hill, looking down on Lough Beg. You can see why they chose it as a place of assembly in Gaelic times and reused in this instance by this massive army. It's a big, beautiful panoramic view in all directions. The big flat top, you could put up tents, you could tether your horses, etc., etc. And this is the view down towards Lough Beg and down to Church Island, which is about there. But you can see from here, we can see Tuam, we can see Lough Neagh. Place worth visiting, although it's in private hands. The two armies then had separated into more reconnoitre together. They could see the fires from the other camp at the other side of the Ban. So we think they camped somewhere, maybe Ballyscullion and Portland, maybe on the shore opposite Church Island. And then they carry out various activities, the 2 or 3 nights, days they stayed on Tully. And this is it summarised. This is the Party Hill here. So they took over this Crannog that belonged to a supporter of Shane O'Neill. They took Tom Castle off the O'Neills of Feva, who were in opposition to the branch of O'Neills that they were supporting. But more importantly for the subject tonight, they visited Church Island. And we find out that Church Island at this stage, and maybe for much of its history, was used and was fortified by the local Gaelic lords. So in addition to the church, you would have had a garrison, and it was a control point in the landscape. In this case, it was fortified by the O'Neills of Tynecastle, who had held the lordship of Clandeboy, but had lost out on it. So they took it from him and gave it to the other O'Neills. Then very, very quickly, the island and the lake and the Ban would have been very central in the foreign line of the 9 Years' War, because it was ultimately Gaelic forces were ultimately defeated across the Ban, across Lough Neagh, by Clotworthy on one side with a fleet and Docker coming from the other side. And that was the end of Gaelic Ireland. Bye-bye. Whole new, Mulholland's lost their lands, all the natives lost their lands, redistributed. Most of the parish was given to the Vintners Company with their headquarters in Ballyscullion. The lands to the south went to Sir Thomas Phillips, one of the leading soldiers during the 9 Year War. He got some of the Mulholland lands, but he also got most of the sort of immense estates of the natives of Kaletra and the headquarters east of Tim. Church Island then was totally abandoned, and a forced abandonment, and the new established church, Anglican church, was built at Ballaghy and Ballaghy Bawn, just about in Stickcar, about to be handed over as a writer centre. But this is the replacement, the official replacement of Church Island. This was later burnt in a minute or two, we'll see. I often think perhaps if we have that church had survived, we may have found that beautiful east window, or what we think is east window, was transported to there. Then, the last urge, we had a generation and a generation and a half of the dispossessed Gaelic lords, and they all joined together in the rebellion of 1641, one of the most confused rebellions in Irish-British history, in that there was a mixture of so many conflicting aims between Covenanters, between royalists, parliamentarians. Our local lord here was Sir Philip O'Neill, very unusual leader of an insurrection, because he was the ideal. He'd been brought up as a fine Protestant gentleman, sent to school in England, was even got educated into course in London, which my research shows he was actually educated at the same time, as Oliver Cromwell, and they probably knew each other. He went to rebellion, and then the great hero, continental hero, returned, and he took over the command. We know so much about it. We know it in great detail, especially in South Derry, because of the depositions that some of you may know about. They're online, so read them. These are statements people had to make for compensation, but they mention individuals, they mention incidents. We can reconstruct the whole sequence of especially of the early years of the war. And it was a terrible war, terrible bloodshed, atrocities on both sides. I can reconstruct from the documents what I would call sort of the South Derry Brigade, though it's not called that, because of the captains that are mentioned in the great O'Mellen's journal and the depositions. And we see, for instance, here the Mulholland's well represented. We'll also see 4 of the grandchildren of the main local Lord Brian Carl O'Neill, and we can see an O'Mellan. That was the last throw of the dice for our local Gaelic elite in the immediate area. But it has one interesting church episode. You probably begin to twig, although it's the church we're talking about, it's also a place of conflict. And it puts its head up at various warfare horizons. This is a fantastic long poem written by a very interesting guy called Payne Fisher. Cromwellian soldier at this time, had been a royalist, changed sides, became a Cromwellian, became a royalist again, survived everything, ended up dying in Newgate in Penury in the 1690s. He declared himself as the poet laureate, Cromwell's poet laureate, self-appointed. And I always think Seamus Heaney would be very amusing that the church on it, that they both wrote poems. Cromwell's Nobel laureate himself wrote poems, or laureate on the end of the stuff. Very long poem and loads of sort of details about the church, which are very interesting, but I'll just quote a few of the lines, my favourite lines. It said, "Alas, about Balahi Amal, or more we spied it lal. More by chance, 'twas then by our cunning cosmography. To this sad church my men are led, and lodge the living among the dead. Without we keep a guard within the chancel made our magazine, so that our church, that's our, may vaunt, she's now truly militant." And I love this line about Balahi. About Balahi, liquor crew of cannibals, the lie Purdue. They seldom range because they keep themselves like wolves that watch the sheep. So then we reach penal times, Catholic church illegal, of course. But there are penal sites within the parish, various townlands. But by folk tradition, at various times, Mass was said inside the roofless ruins of the church. But of course, burial continued there. During this period too, the Scullions continued their pastoral duties. For instance, 1631, Father Patrick Scullion is parish priest of Ballyscullion and Terminini, and then another Scullion is a parish priest of McErlean and Killinay. So the Scullions were ministering to big bulk of the parishes in South Derry, and that continues right down to Catholic emancipation. Then another quick new horizon. So different from the previous ones. The island becomes a part of a design landscape. This great figure, fascinating figure of the Archbishop, Frederick Harvey, Bishop of Derry. He sought out getting the bishopric because the bishopric of Derry was the richest diocese in Ireland because of its landed wealth. So it was a plum among the Irish diocesan centres. But when he was bishop, he inherited the family title, although I think he was the fourth son. Called the edifying bishop because he had a passion for building structures and renewing churches and building country houses. Fascinating man, quite radical in politics, but he spent most of his time on a lifetime extended grand tour. But he fell in love with the landscape around Ballyscullion. He said it reminded him of the Italian lakes. From just north of the island, he said, if you look south, you could see the mountains of Mourne, you could see Lord O'Neill's new bridge just built, picturesque tomb, and you had the lakes. So he built this fantastic palace, the Palace of Ballyscullion there, with this central rotunda based on the Parthenon in Rome. Sadly, he left. Building started in 1787. Wasn't completed until 1803. He left Ireland in 1793, never to return. It's doubtful whether he spent a night there because it was largely unfinished. The fabric was there, but it hadn't been furnished. It was built to house this great collection of oil paintings and classical antiquity, etc. His family built a replica of it at the Earl of Bristol, now Marquess of Bristol in Ickworth. But this is a reconstruction of it. Now, of course, Belfast is a very strong connection with it because that portico, if you walk down High Street tomorrow, you'll see that portico. It was bought and transported to Belfast. He had a pat also for church spires. And he put them on Church Island because it did embellish the view from his palace. But he was all delighted with himself. He put up a lot more in the Derry diocese, and he was able to get them erected without having to pay for it. He got other people to pay for it. This is his spire here, which is what makes Church Island so prominent in the landscape. This is what you see from a vast distance, from that new roadway. If you look north, you'll see this rising through the copse of trees above the marshes, and people say, what's that? Who don't know what it is. It's also cost HED a fortune because they've spent so much money restoring that beautiful cut stone spire, which had become bent. And here is the example that was built in Ballyscullion itself, on that Church of Ireland church I showed you. And they were all built sort of the same plan, sort of at 3 different stages with their colours, etc., etc. So you could be called an inspiring bishop, I always think, as well as an edifying bishop. And this is it. And of course, it's not bonded into the original church. Now, we do know the name of the original builder, and his family is still in the locality. It was Robert Keenan, and he's said to be buried in the base there. HED have just finished another session of consolidating it. So that's below. You're rising quickly, or are on the gallop towards the end, we got to know. The palace was demolished. And then about 30, 40 years later, his cousins, the inheritors, the Brusses, built their country house there, designed the landscape around it, which included Church Island. And their main contribution was a little summer house that has left no trace we can find yet up here. But also they planted the still extant Irish yews, Florence Court yews, which are a great embellishment to the graveyard. Then the end of the island, the drainage and navigation scheme, that great bit of work by the Board of Works, cost a fortune, apart from relieving very bad flooding every year. South of Kilrea, 30,000 acres flooded annually. Behind that 30,000 acres, 100 acres saturated. Landscape water can get away. It partially solved that problem. But the big thrust of it was also tied into a navigation scheme, building of locks, etc., to make the lower Bann navigable, which it wasn't because there are various fords and rocks going across it. So that was, I think, Belfast and Uri with the north coast. Very sad thing. Those were the very years the railways were going everywhere. So it's a total financial disaster, far cheaper to move everything by railway. So that didn't work. So we say goodbye to the island, and this is the sequence of the drainage. We see 1833 map, see Church Island and its lake, and then by 1860 the water level started to drop, and then by 1900 or so we get all this new consolidated land, which outside the modern townland matrix, so it's called intake. You get intakes all over the place, which documents land that has been taken from either the sea or four lakes. It created a whole new ecological niche and very important ASSI of what is called the Strand. And this colonized by all sorts of rare plants, orchids, very rich herbage. Just to show you the hidden powers of nature, or the creative powers of nature, then that should suddenly appear. A crowd of local people got together, including my own grandfather, and thought what a beautiful race course it would make. Cups were put up, plate, etc. Big day, first day. There'd been rain the day before, and the race course was totally unusable. The horses would have needed life jackets or whatever. But it did continue 4 years and then fizzled out. And that's it on the little map. But anyway, come the Great Revival, part of the Gaelic Revival. This is Francis Joseph Beggar, as I call him, St. Francis Joseph. The he renewed the society here. He was the editor. It got reissued the Ulster Journal of Archaeology. He's been I think you've had a lecture him here a few years ago. He's been called a cultural visionary. He was into everything and was a great leader. Born into a very prominent Belfast mercantile Presbyterian family. Went to Inst. His grandfather was on the founder of Inst. Became totally nationalistic. Had built a house out on the Antrim Road, Ardree, where he entertained all. Great friend of Roger Casement, everybody else, all the great figures at the time. Loved his Gaelic revival outfit here in his kilt. And when I come back in 2050, I might wear an outfit like that. If that's all. Original impetus was by a local man, Sean Keenan of Leitrim Townland, joining the thing. And then Francis Joseph came in and he really energized the whole thing. And the main thrust was to revive the pilgrimage in a proper way on the big Sunday, as we call it, on the 7th of September to Churchland. We've got very good press coverage of the first day. Glad to say I got my grandfather Thaddeus, and we keep up the Thaddeus name, was part of the committee. Francis Joseph arrived down. He brought a pipe band with him and led it in with the pipers. He very prominent archaeologically. Its greatest monument probably is Jordan's Castle. He restored that and lived in it for a while. Again, you need to do more research. He left all this vast collection of documents and books to the Central Library, so if you go there, you'll be able to explore his life. But he was a wonderful influence in this society. If it weren't for him, I probably wouldn't be here. Again, the first day was a great success, a victim of a success. Maybe a few thousand turned up. They came by train, they came by bus, charabanc, etc. Got to the island, could walk to the island on the western side, flotilla boats on the Antrim side. But sadly, as the newspaper account records, there was 500 people unable to get to the island because there wasn't enough boats. So that was very frustrating for them. Colonel Bruce of Ballyscullion House had to make his presence felt. And as you read here, he sent out 2 or 3 of his gamekeepers to get the names of the people for the purpose of prosecuting them for trespass. However, everybody found it very amusing and they saw the futility of their task and they soon just went off. And then the vast concourse, it says, assembled the south end of the church. The next year was probably equally moving because it was addressed by Sir Shane Leslie, another fascinating figure of the period. Shane Leslie of Castle Leslie, first cousin of Winston Churchill. Both their mothers were daughter princesses, the Jerome sisters. He had the conventional upbringing of an Anglo-Irish aristocrat, Eton and then Cambridge. At Cambridge, he converted to Catholicism in 1908. Had a strong desire, became a Dominican friar, but was persuaded not to. He went to Germany, he went to Russia, and for a few months lived with Tolstoy. And Tolstoy became a lifelong friend. He totally went native, and he, like Beggar, was extremely fond of his Celtic outfit and wore his kilt as often as he could. Changed his name from John to Shane, which he was quite insistent he should be called Sean. His speech was very political on church because he was caught up with one of the great issues of the time, which was the issue of the stolen waters, that the Lough Beg fishermen should have every right to fish, and that it was their right for time immemorial. And I quote from a bit of a speech here, he said, "The gull might go fishing, the otter might go hunting at night, and the heron might have its full of fish by day, but the children of Ireland, no." And apparently that was accompanied with great cheer. So The Lough Beg fishermen regard him as a bit of a patron saint, which is nice. So there's big claim to fame, or many claims to fame, but he acted as a sort of backdoor or conduit between Winston Churchill, the treaty, Lloyd George, and the treaty talks. And later on, at various times, he was a sounding board for both sides. He became a great friend of De Valera's, as well as maintaining his friendship with his cousin Winston Churchill. He's many things. He wrote novels, etc. Prominent literary critic. He wasn't very fond of James Joyce. Didn't like Ulysses. Said it was like vomit on the floor. And he's quite abusive of poor Molly Bloom in her soliloquy. In 1960, he handed the title deeds to Lough Derg, probably the greatest single pilgrimage point in Ireland, which his family inherited to the Catholic Church. World War II, very, very quickly. Church Island had to get in on the act of World War II, of course. Just south at Tuam, there was an aerodrome. Very sadly, on the 15th of May 1943, this Beaufort aeroplane crashed on Church Island. And the report here tells us what they think happened. The pilot had to make a forced landing, which took him over the church. The engine seemed to be playing up. So he stalled the aircraft at approximately 100 feet, crashed at a very steep angle just beyond the church. And four young men were killed. That's them below. None of them are buried on the island. Sergeant Holmes buried in Milltown, Sergeant Kirby, City Cemetery, Sergeant Taylor back in his native Sheffield, Sergeant Parks, which I think was the American, and he was buried in Worcestershire. The locals hoped to put up a little plaque when we come out when we were reading it. In my time, a lot of the older people used to tell me about the fuselage, which was there for years. I know one man who made a lovely ring for his girlfriend out of the fuselage. Then quickly, we're at the end. You'd be glad to hear the final of the gallop, and this, to me, covers the points I want to make. First of all, the church is not an archaeological site, though it's ruined. But probably the single greatest significance is not so much the Ballon and the pilgrimage thing. It is our local ancestral graveyard. And the local community looked to church on it. That's where their ancestral bones are. And quickly to look at the graves. This is the typical of any churchyard anywhere. The great minding of the graves, especially Irish ones. Great minding of the graves on the East End. The belief was the nearer you got to the East End where Mass was said where the altar was, the greater chance you had to get to heaven. So it's usually any Irish churchyard. Always look at the East End, you see the principal local families there. This is a surrounding wall built quite late, 1870s or so, by the council to try and protect it, because the perch graveyards had a horrendous history. Cameron, could you turn the lights off? I want to frighten everybody for Halloween. Oh no, maybe better not. I call this skullduggery. There was this medieval belief that the skull, the moss that grew in the skull of dead men had fantastic medical properties. That it could cure all sorts of illnesses like epilepsy or whatever. It was also believed if the person died a violent death, if he were a criminal that was hanging for months on a gibbet, or if he died in battle, that moss was stronger. Now, we do know in Ireland had a great export trade in the 17th, 18th, and early 19th century of that moss, but we can't pinpoint anywhere where it went on. But we can't to Church Island, because it's this lovely statement Richard Dobbs wrote in his description of County Antrim. In 1683, he says about Church Island, there may be had a store of moss that grows on dead men's skulls, useful in staunching blood, and said to be the great ingredient in making sympathetic powder. Most of it went to Germany, and the process was it was dried and then it was pounded into powder, and I think you sniffed it. So God knows how many skulls, or maybe They probably ransacked the graveyard for that. I'm sure the Scullions didn't do it. I don't know who was at it, you know. Anyway, it gets worse. With this in 1864, a reference in the local paper Outcry that there was a herd of pigs on the island, and they were ripping up the whole graveyard, including quite recent graves, and there was limbs all over the place. And they said they're undermining the gravestones. It was said about the only grave to remain unmolested was that of Father Patrick O'Scullion, whose grave was protected by a recumbent slab, and the pigs couldn't get underneath it. So that's very sad. Also, slightly earlier in the century is the report of 20 headstones being broken up for vandalism, etc., etc. Terrible. It was isolated, so it couldn't really be looked after all the time. This is a fairly recent map of the existing gravestones above ground, and they're all fairly late. Few 18th century, was in the 19th century. Just quickly to show you the concentration of scullions on the east end, outside the east end of the church, and then with another area family nearby, and we have the Keenans. I think the McErleans are way in the periphery somewhere. So, recalling the great medieval days, this is one of the earliest, and it's the body of Culla Mulholland, obviously descended from the native stock. Culla was a very popular name among Mulhollands, along with Teague. But then they can claim the grave of the grandparents of the first Labour Prime Minister of Australia, 1929, 1932. James Scullion, his grandparents are buried there. Although he was only Premier for about 3 years, he was terribly prominent in throughout a long career, trade unions, etc. So that is a lovely ancestral grave out there. But sadly, the last burials there from the 1930s, the Catholic Church closed officially the graveyard, as did the local council, much to the anguish of people who had graves there, but they had to obey it, and they had to bury in Ballyscullion or for Ballyscullion. But this is a description of one of the last burials. It's the Miss Margaret Diamond, from the area, lived in Belfast, and when her remains were brought down for burial in Church Island, it was one of the occasional floods. So it was like a reenactment of what all those medieval burials would have been like. And there was a flotilla, a little fleet of boats, taking the body out, taking on the mourner side, and it attracted, a great sort of interest in local people who gathered up to see. So that was like one of the last burials there. It's very sad. So, getting to the very end, the island a few years ago suffered quite a lot of degradation, which we're all concerned by. The cattle on the strand were getting in, the fence wasn't maintained, it was very heavy cattle trump. Something needed to be done. EHS, HED have responded, and we've gone through a period of restoration, good fences, renewal of the fabric of the church. This is the work that started about 2 years ago. The scaffolding going up, they've already finished the spire. And the fabric of the church was a bit dangerous. Not that bad, but it used to have the safety areas. Falling masonry is always a problem. So at the moment, it's probably looking the best it's looked, since maybe for 400 or 500 years. And the big Sunday continues. And it's a great day, depending on the weather. This was it on a lovely sunny day a few years ago. Car parking is very difficult, so the local farmers let us use their fields. If it hasn't rained for a few weeks, you can go on foot out. It's a very moving day, and many people turn up. This is a couple of years ago in fantastic weather. In fact, there was almost too many to get into the enclosure. The normal prayer that they do the Stations of the Cross, etc., and people, visit their graves. This year it was carried out in atrocious weather, probably the wettest Sunday in years. There was almost tropical downpour and then it eased a bit. But fortunately, a local parishioner, Baron McErlean, came to the rescue with a great mobile tractory thing, and took people out. Some people walked out, but took people out in a road system, both on the island and off the island. And you could see the pleasure in people's faces. As Chaucer told us how great it was, great fun to go on pilgrimage with this sort of mini pilgrimage here. What I want to emphasize, because we're almost at the end, is it's a very special site, but it has a lot of difficulties for management, for archaeological management, because it's not just an archaeological site, it's still living in a sort of spiritual sense. It's still a big place of identity and local community. And this carries with it a great responsibility for ACD in this case, and for we archaeologists to regard with great sensitivity and to make sure both sides are fully catered for and balanced. And that, I say, that is difficult and calls for great communication and great communication skills. But I think we're getting there with it. There are a number of other sites still like that, but not that many. Most have lost this dimension. So the very special thing about Church Island is that it is preserved that. And I just end with this lovely drawing by Rosamund Mulholland. The Mulhollands are back in the big house, or back in the area, Ballyscullion House, a branch of the Dudley family. And Rosamund has just done this lovely sketch, and she sketched them all. So you're all dying to get home, babies to bath, and big brother to see, etc. So I shall leave you with that. I'll see you all 2050. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much indeed. As always, you've given us an absolutely wonderful talk. And we certainly hope it will not be another 25 years before you give us.
Heard that before.
Well, we have heard you, I think, now and again at shorter
Right.
conferences and so on in between. But it was an absolute delight to have him talking about something that's so close to his own heart with his family and the various families who are still in there. I think it's amazing that to be traced back that some of the
Absolutely.
the original people.
A part of my friend Colin, who's up here. Colin was talking to Neve there before. Colin's up this body as one of his cousins. So hopefully maybe DNA pushes the scullion.
We'll await that with interest indeed.
If you'll be in trouble if she's not. Of course. Probably left everybody confused. Any questions now? Any online questions there?
Yes, please.
Sorry.
Would you care to speculate on what the early enclosure was for us?
What size?
The early enclosure,
Yes.
would you care to speculate what it might be?
It was an earthen bank. Yeah. It would be like what we know from a lot of other monastic sites.
You don't think it might pre-exist the monastic site?
No, probably not. You hear a lot of nonsense like that, but it's only very rarely, maybe in a Hillford or whatever. People sometimes say that to prove continuity, but need the excavation. The great thing about those enclosure banks is that we excavate and we get a buried turf line below. And hopefully we'll get a bit of carbon out of it, we can date them. So that would solve that problem. It is a valid speculation, but they tend to think, no, not still set to be proved. Everybody else all right? Here, stumbling with the signs.
Well, I think you've given us all so much to think about. It wasn't really familiar with what to say.
Well, how do you think there in June, I think?
Well, as I say, we're looking forward to that. There was a day out in
Parasite Derry.
South Derry next year, so we're out for that. We'll be really thanks, right?
Thank you.
As always, Tom's put so much into it, and I feel that it really came from the heart as well.
I didn't get the sympathy vote for the hand.
You know, to come with.
I stepped round the corner, it was 3 weeks ago. Cut long story short, great. Got a big metal plate in here. So that's why the lecture was.
No, with a big thank you from McErlean. Here's a little
Oh, for
token of
goodness sake.
appreciation from.
Wow. Okay.